Hey everybody, welcome to the video, and if you're wondering why there's no empty room behind me, as everyone likes to tell me in the comments, I'm not in my original place, so if the lighting looks different or anything else looks different, I'd have no green screen. That is the reason why. But we're here talking the 3-game Thanksgiving Day slate over on DraftKings on Thursday. This is my favorite time of the year. Football, family, friends, and food. Can't really beat it, so I'm definitely excited to break this one down, even if the games aren't that exciting this year. But I will never complain about having football on Thanksgiving, especially 3 games at that. And if you do find this video helpful in any way possible, make sure you leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet already. If you want to take that one step further, become an official member over on Patreon. Link is down below in the description for that. And since we're past the 23rd of the month, if you do want to sign up, I can refund this last week for you as long as you do stay signed up on December 1st. If you want to check it out, you can get a free week of content, NBA and NFL. Then the MLB and NASCAR once those seasons start back up again. And last but not least, this video is sponsored by Prize Picks. I'm sure most of you know it is by now, but if you don't, it's daily fantasy sports simplified. Just you versus the projections. There's no sharks, 150 max contests, or salary cap restrictions, or anything like that. Just you versus the props they offer each and every single day. And as of right now, if you're new Sunday over on Prize Picks, you can get a free money bonus. That's an instant deposit match up to $100 when you use code CPEN and tell them I sent you. It's free money, so why not use it to your advantage? But I think that's it for the plugs for the most part, so without further ado, let's dive into today's video. I do want to mention I traveled all the way from Florida to Ohio, and I'm only staying a few days. I don't have as much time as I'd like to record a bunch of videos for the Thanksgiving Day slate, so this is probably the only one we're going to get. So I'm going to try to wrap it all together, core plays, lineup building, and just the final picks video. We'll try to build a lineup at the end, just going over the picks that we just talked about. But we'll start at the quarterback position as always, and we have 3 options here after you kind of cut off the guys that just really aren't going to be viable, because we only have 6 quarterbacks, 3 games. And half of them are Jared Goff or Tim Boyle, whoever plays. Sounds like it's going to be Jared Goff. Then you have Trevor Siemian. And then it looks like Andy Dalton. So I don't think those guys are really going to be in the optimal lineup. So after that, we're left with Josh Allen at $7,800, Dak Prescott at $6,900, and then Derek Carr at $5,900. If you're playing tournaments, whatever like wide receivers you have or whatever pass catching options you have, you probably want to line them up with the quarterback that you're using. I think in cash games, most people would go Dak Prescott below $7,000 because all of his pass catching options are dirt cheap, and he's cheap, and they have the highest implied team total on the slate. But we'll start up top here with Josh Allen. He is pretty expensive. That's the only reason you're not playing Josh Allen, because if pricing wasn't a thing, he's my favorite quarterback on the slate. I have him as the highest projected. He offers you a good rushing floor, which also presents a pretty high ceiling. He's got great weapons to get the ball to, and Stephon Diggs, Dawson Knox, Emmanuel Sanders, and Cole Beasley, even though he can be a bit more hit or miss. They don't have a run game whatsoever. It's just a mixture of Zach Moss, Devin Singletary, and Matt Breida. They basically use Josh Allen as the RB1 a lot of the times. I will say the matchup isn't great versus New Orleans. They do have a pretty solid defense, whether it be versus the pass or the run. Their implied team total also isn't nearly as high as the Cowboys, as they're sitting at 29 compared to 25.75 for the Bills. Game also features a 45.5 point over-under, 6-point favorites. They are also on the road in New Orleans. But Josh Allen in the season has been one of the best fantasy quarterbacks in football. Nearly 285 passing yards per game, over 2 passing touchdowns, throwing the ball around 35 times per game, and also 34 rushing yards, which is kind of like a built-in passing touchdown floor once you factor in how many points that he equates to, and also he's always a threat around the goal line as well. Now the Saints, DVOA-wise, they're not terrible, 13th DVOA versus the pass, but they're still 26 versus quarterbacks. It's still a pretty solid defense. They're definitely a lot better versus the run than they are versus the pass, but I think Allen's fine if you have the money for him. And obviously, if you're using Stephon Diggs or any of the pass-catching options, you want to get Josh Allen in there for the correlation. And since it's such a small slate, like on a showdown slate, you want to try to correlate your lineups as best as possible. Try to make sure correlation-wise your lineups do make some sense. Because if you're using Josh Allen with none of his pass-catching options on a small slate like this, I mean, yeah, there's a chance it could be optimal because crazy things could happen, but more than likely you're going to want some pass-catching options with them. And you can break the rules on a slate like this. Like normally, you don't want to like quadruple stack, but if you have like 4 pass-catching options with the guy, it's not the worst thing you can do out there just because there's a lack of options. Dak Prescott, $6,900. I imagine he's going to be the chalk quarterback on this slate. Now, Josh Allen, Derek Carr will have some ownership, but Prescott at this price point, I mean, below 7K, they have the highest implied team total on the slate. Yeah, I will say no Amari Cooper or CeeDee Lamb, more than likely. That is not confirmed, but I highly doubt he plays, but I guess it's still possible. But assuming he is out, yeah, his 2 best pass catching options being out is definitely going to be a hit to Dak Prescott, but I still like him quite a bit. Like, he's still too cheap. Cedric Wilson, Noah Brown, Michael Gallup can still, I think, have solid games here. Dalton Schultz has not been bad this year. Zeke Elliott involved in the passing game. Now, they could just run the ball a lot more, but I mean, it's hard not to like Dak at this price point just because we don't have that many options, and paying nearly $8,000 for Josh Allen does hurt you in some other positions, which I think are maybe a little bit more important because I feel like Dak on a point per dollar basis can kind of be right up there with Josh Allen unless he happens to have a blow-up game. So I am liking Dak quite a bit. If we're looking at the Raiders defensively so far this season, not been terrible, but still 22nd DVA versus the pass and kind of mid-pack versus quarterbacks. But do like Dak quite a bit. Probably my favorite quarterback on the slate, the one I'd had the most exposure to if you are building multiple lineups. Then Derek Carr, if you're looking for the punt option, I do like this game the most out of the 3 games because obviously the Bears versus the Lions should probably be a pretty ugly game. I don't have the total presented to me. I mean, once I look at Dave Montgomery, I guess on the running back page. So they're sitting at 41.5. The Saints and Bills are sitting at 45.5, and then obviously the Raiders and Cowboys have the highest at 50.5. So I feel like a lot of people will have most of the exposure in their lineups coming from this game, which I totally understand. It's definitely the best one to target, in my opinion. And Derek Carr, I mean, he's not the most exciting fantasy quarterback to use, but he's still averaging around 300 passing yards per game, throwing the ball nearly 35 times per game and 8.1 yards per attempt. Obviously, the loss of Henry Ruggs kind of hurts the deep passing game, but you still have Darren Waller, Bryan Edwards, a couple of other guys that are okay, like Hunter Renfrow, to get the ball to. So I think Carr is fine, more so in tournaments. I mean, you could go there in cash games just because he's cheap, and I feel like per dollar wise, he should be solid on this slate. I don't think he has the ceiling of guys like Dak Prescott or Josh Allen, but if you're just looking for a quarterback that could get you 15 plus points, I think Derek Carr definitely makes some sense here. And the Cowboys have given up some pretty big games to quarterbacks so far this year. Now, overall, they haven't been bad. 3rd DVA versus the pass and 12th versus fantasy quarterbacks, but still allowing nearly 270 passing yards per game. It's mainly just a price thing for me on Derek Carr. If this was a main slate, I don't think I have any interest in Derek Carr, but since it's a 3-game slate and the other 3 quarterbacks are basically useless, I think that makes Derek Carr somewhat playable here. And moving on to the running back position, I won't say it's a very deep position, but there is some solid options here given the guys that we have. And I will say there's an obvious option and probably the highest owned player in the entire slate, Dave Montgomery at only $6,000 versus Detroit, one of the worst run defenses of football. We'll talk a little bit about him more once we get to him. But we'll up top with Zeke Elliott, $8,000. Pretty good spot for Zeke if you have the money. The problem is a lot of people are going to be going with Dak Prescott and the pass catching option. So at that point, it's like, do you really want to play the running back as well? Which is a small slate, and they have the highest implied team total, 29 points. So I don't hate using Dak Prescott in addition to Zeke Elliott with the pass catching options because they're probably going to score the most points in this slate. At least that's what's projected by Vegas, and they're typically pretty smart. So I wouldn't hate it. It doesn't feel the greatest correlation-wise, but just raw points-wise, Zeke, if you had the money for him, is definitely a very solid option. He's a 7.5-point favorite, playing at home, 29-point implied team total. Yes, he gets some touches taken away from Tony Pollard, but he gets the majority of the touches, plays the majority of the snaps. He's involved in the passing game. He kind of checks almost every single box for me, and he's the goal line running back. So there's really no reason not to like Zeke besides the expensive price point, because I totally get it. Because if you are spending up for a guy like Stephon Diggs or Darren Waller on this slate, it's kind of hard to fit in Zeke as well. But it's a good spot versus the Raiders. Their run defense has not been very good this season. 16th DVOA, but 26 versus running backs. And they're also allowing nearly 5.5 catches per game and over 100 rushing yards. So I think Zeke, if you had the money for him, definitely in a pretty good spot, averaging over 15 rushing attempts per game, 4.6 yards per carry, and nearly 4 targets per game. DeAndre Swift, $7,300. He's been great the past 2 weeks. Ripped off like a nearly 60-yard rushing touchdown versus the Cleveland Browns last week. He's always involved in the passing game. It sounds like Jared Goff is going to play, which I guess is good for him because he has no problem dumping it off like 10 times to DeAndre Swift. And the matchup versus the Bears, it's kind of weird. They're 21st DVA versus the run, but they're also 11th versus fantasy running backs, allowing less than a rushing touchdown per game, but over 100 rushing yards. They're just not really getting beat up in the passing game by running backs too much, only 31 receiving yards per game. But DeAndre Swift, he is just pretty much like Alvin Kamara this year in terms of just not getting a ton of carries on the ground, besides that one game versus Pittsburgh where he had 33 carries, but a 20% target share in this offense, about 14 carries per game, 43 receiving yards on 6.5 targets. His floor is very safe just because of how involved he is in the passing game, and he's just been getting more touches recently, so I think obviously DeAndre Swift is definitely a fantastic play if you had the money for him. I would say probably the most popular combo will be DeAndre Swift and David Montgomery in cash games. I think it'll be close between him and Zeke, but since a lot of people are going to be going with the passing attack for the Cowboys, I could see DeAndre Swift kind of creeping above Ezekiel Elliott, and then obviously paired with David Montgomery, especially in cash games, but I do like DeAndre Swift a lot. And then Mark Ingram, he is currently questionable to play, assuming Kamara is out, and if Ingram plays, he's been getting pretty much all the snaps and all the touches in this offense, even with Tony Jones returning last week. Yeah, there's Dwayne Washington. If Ingram happened to miss, we have a whole other problem in New Orleans. We'll have to try to figure out that running back situation. That'll be Jones and Washington. But hoping Ingram plays, he's grading out pretty well point per dollar wise, and if he's fully healthy, gets a good practice in today, I can see a lot of people going with Ingram and Dave Montgomery in the running back position. Then you have a lot of money to spend for a guy like Stephon Diggs, maybe even upgrade to Josh Allen over Dak Prescott. Just really depends on which way you want to go. But just kind of keep your eyes peeled for the news on Mark Ingram. I am recording this video in the morning, so I don't know if he's going to practice today or not. But if he does, good to go. I like him at $6,200. Even though the matchup, I wouldn't say is fantastic versus the Bills. The run defense this year, third DVOA and allowing the 7th fewest points per game to the position. But they have had a pretty soft schedule versus the run. And the two good running teams they played this year in Buffalo and the Colts, they kind of got an absolute thrash. Now, not really fair because the sample size is Derrick Henry and Jonathan Taylor, but I'm just saying the times they've actually faced good running backs, good running teams, they have given up a lot of points. So that is something to keep in mind. But Mark Ingram has also been using the passing game, which has boosted his floor as well. Then David Montgomery, he is the chalk lord this weekend. No really reason not to like him. He's just underpriced in my opinion. And I was going into this slate last week thinking, I'm guaranteeing DraftKings is going to underprice David Montgomery, or I'm going to play him on Thanksgiving. And well, that's exactly where we are. He's a 3-point favorite, not playing at home, but he's involved in the passing game a little bit. Averaging 16 carries per game this year, 4.5 yards per carry. I mean, it's like a 7% target. It's just nothing crazy, like nearly 2 targets per game. It's just not an exciting offense, but it's mainly just the matchup here. 29th DVA versus the run, allowing the 3rd most points per game to the position, a rushing touchdown, and over 110 rushing yards. David Montgomery is just kind of an easy plug and play here, especially if you are going in cash games and tournaments. I understand wanting to get leverage and fading him, but I mean, as long as he just has a somewhat decent game. Like if he hits his medium projection, you're going to want David Montgomery in your lineups. Moving on to the wide receiver position, I try to keep this as simple as possible because it really comes down to who are using a quarterback, what game are you stacking, who do you want to run it back with, because in cash games you can use these guys as one-offs, but if you're using Dak Prescott, you're going to want multiple pass catching options with him on such a small slate. Like if you're using Dak, use Michael Gallup, use Cedric Wilson. There is about 40% of the targets being vacated right now, assuming CeeDee Lamb is out. CeeDee Lamb, it's like a 22% target share, and Mark Cooper on a 27% target share. Both guys averaging around 7 targets per game. Take that off the field, there's a lot of targets to go around. Cedric Wilson played the majority of the snaps last week, mainly in the slot. Like 30 of his 31 snaps were in the slot. Cowboys looked terrible last week, but they should bounce back here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. But $3,500, assuming CD is out, hard not to like Wilson. He is going to get targets. And then Michael Gallup had a ton of targets last week, didn't really do anything with them whatsoever. Had a nice garbage time catch for I forget how many yards, ended up with 9-some points, but he had a lot of targets, just couldn't really come down with them. But at $5,900, Cedric Wilson at $3,500, really hard not to like them. And if you're using Dak, obviously you're going to want to pair him up with those guys. If you're using Josh Allen, try your best to get Stephon Diggs in. You don't have to play Diggs because he's expensive. If you already have Zeke in with Josh Allen and maybe another guy like DeAndre Swift, you're not going to be able to afford Diggs on this site unless you just go complete dumpster diving everywhere else. But you can use guys like Emmanuel Sanders, Dawson Knox, or Cole Beasley at only $4,500. Beasley will probably be pretty popular on the site just because of the price point, and he typically gets peppered with targets, although he can be hit or miss. Like there's some games where he just gets like 1 to 3 targets, and there's some games where he gets 10 plus targets. You just kind of have to spin the wheel and hope for the best on Cole Beasley, but point per dollar wise, he does great out well, and optimizers will spit him out. He's getting spit out on mine. I don't feel great about it, but I think he's a somewhat decent option here. As far as Darnell Mooney and Hunter Renfrow, if you are stacking the Cowboys guys, running it back with the Raiders guy, like either Darren Waller or Hunter Renfrow, I think that's fine. Hunter Renfrow is a pretty safe option on the Raiders. Typically gets quite a bit of targets, and obviously Henry Ruggs has definitely helped just getting more targets in general. Over 5 catches per game, nearly 7 targets per game, and a 20% target share. He is not an exciting player, but he typically does get the job done. Then as far as Darnell Mooney goes, he had 16 targets last week with Andy Dalton. And it sounds like Allen Robinson is not going to play. Mooney is still questionable for this game, but it sounds like he's trending towards playing. Robinson kind of going the opposite direction if he happens to be out. Mooney is a good wide receiver. I think Mooney right now is a better wide receiver than Allen Robinson. So if he's going to get me, I don't know, let's say he can get 10 plus targets again, that might be pushing it. I'm not sure 16 targets will ever happen again, but if he's going to get some pretty heavy volume facing the Detroit Lions, I think Mooney should definitely be in play. I'm not a big fan of stacking that game up too much, but Mooney and DeAndre Swift and David Montgomery definitely the standouts in that game besides maybe some of the tight ends as well. But I do like Mooney, talented wide receiver, and a fantastic matchup versus that Lions defense. And then moving on to the tight end position, besides Darren Waller and maybe even Dalton Schultz and kind of TJ Hawkinson, this is not a great slate for it. Like Waller, he's perceived as one of the best tight ends in football, and he is. He's very good. He's just not getting the kind of work or volume that we expected, especially after week 1 where he had 19 targets in that game versus Baltimore. And I feel like Dalton Schultz can do somewhat similar to Waller at a much cheaper price point. Plus, I have a lot more interest in Dak Prescott than I do Darren Waller. And a lot of the times on these Thanksgiving Day slates, I end up going double tight end. I usually regret it afterwards, but I end up going double tight end just to make some things work to get in studs. Like, if I have to use like a Jawan Johnson, the flex spot, instead of like a Cole Beasley just to fit in a guy like Stephon Diggs or Zeke Elliott, There's times where I do that on these Thanksgiving Day slates just because I feel like having that stud might be worth more than having the more maybe so balanced lineup that just doesn't have quite the ceiling. So that's something to keep in mind. I'll kind of go through this quick, but really just again, kind of similar to the wide receivers, it depends on what quarterback you're using. Unless you're playing cash games where you just play kind of the most optimal guy. Waller, though, if you're using Derek Carr, he's the top option for Carr. Facing Dallas, they have not been very good versus tight ends so far this year. I think he's fine. He still gets plenty of volume, and as far as tight ends go, I mean, a lot of tight ends would be jealous of the kind of work he gets. Dalton Schultz, with no Blake Jarwin, he is the main tight end one there, and Dak Prescott loves getting the ball to Dalton Schultz. I think he is firmly in play. I'm going to bring up their target numbers just so you have that on the screen, because that's kind of what you care about more, because I think you guys all know what teams these guys play on. But he's certainly nearly 6 targets per game and a 16% target share. And keep in mind, no Amari Cooper or CeeDee Lamb, more than likely. Schultz will definitely probably push for like hopefully 8+ targets in this game versus the Raiders. T.J. Hawkinson typically gets a lot of volume. He did have I think he's had a couple bad games this year, but typically he's going to get work. Again, not a huge fan of that game, so I don't really see myself going to Hawkinson too much, but he's certainly in play for me. He's a talented tight end, always is a threat to score. Dawson Knox, if you're using Josh Allen, he's just a cheap way to get exposure to the Bills, so I don't mind Dawson Knox whatsoever. Cole Kmet, I think he was the highest on tight end last week. It was close between a couple guys. But Cole Kmet was very chalky versus Baltimore. Didn't do anything. Had like 2.4 fantasy points. It was either 2 catches or 1, but didn't really do anything. I think this is a fine bounce back spot versus the Lions. If you just want, like, I don't want to spend a ton of money in this game outside of guys like DeAndre Swift or Darnell Mooney or even David Montgomery. And Cole Kmet's cheap, so it's not like you're spending like $5K for a guy like Cole Kmet. So I think that's fine if you just want a cheap part of that game. Just because Kmet, I mean, overall this season, he hasn't been bad. Like, for his price point, nearly 4.5 targets per game and a 17.5% target share. That's not bad. Keep in mind, Andy Dalton's going to be the quarterback, so it doesn't feel as good. But, I mean, Andy Dalton get a lot of targets to guys like Mooney and the Goodwin as well. It's just not a pretty game whatsoever. Jawan Johnson, though, so no Troutman. So Jawan Johnson is going to be the tight end one for the Saints. He's only $2,600. Like, if he just catches a couple balls and he falls into the end zone at that price point, that is great value. So I think if you want to go like double tight end, or if you just want to go use one tight end, use Jawan Johnson as a punt option. He should play the majority of the snaps, hopefully get a few targets. He's averaging over a target per game this year, so with no Troutman, he does open some things up if you want to get down and dirty at the tight end position. And as far as defenses go, there's like 3 I like: Bills, Bears, or Lions. Basically, either trying to get either defense in that very low-scoring game, at least projected to be, or the Bills defense, just because they're facing Trevor Siemian. They've been good this year. They are on the road, which I never love, but it's less than a 20-point implied team total against them, and they're 6-point favorites, and well, obviously not very scared of Trevor Siemian, especially if Alvin Kamara's out. That just makes it a little bit easier because they just don't have that many great weapons on offense. So I think we're kind of done breaking down these positions. So we'll head over to DraftKings and try to just put together a lineup quickly, kind of just based on what we've talked about so far already. So like I was saying, I'm going to probably go towards maybe more of a tournament lineup because I like the Cowboys and Raiders game a lot. Not saying I'm not going to play Josh Allen in cash games. It's going to either be Josh Allen or Dak Prescott for me in cash more than likely. But for this build, I want to go with Dak Prescott. And keep in mind, guys, I am not building you guys a lineup to recommend to play on your contest. I will be using the optimizer, and I'll have to put a little more thought into this. But I'm just trying to do it swiftly for you guys, just so we can have something to work with. And at running back, since I'm going to be going with the passing game for the Cowboys, I'll actually kind of just plug those guys in first. So just going straight to Dallas. Assuming CeeDee Lamb is out, I think it's very highly unlikely he doesn't play. I'm going to go with Michael Gallup and Cedric Wilson. You could also look at Noah Brown at $3,000. I think he's a fine dirt cheap punt option, but I do feel more comfortable with Gallup and Wilson. But if you do want to use Noah Brown in tournaments, I think that's not the worst thing in the world to do. I like David Montgomery a lot at the running back position. He is just too cheap, in my opinion, a good spot versus Detroit. I would expect him to be more than likely the highest owned player on the entire slate, especially in cash games. Then at that point, we have to either pick between Ezekiel Elliott and DeAndre Swift. And since we have the passing attack for the Cowboys, not saying you can't play Elliott with them, but I think I'm going to go with DeAndre Swift here, just because I like the floor. He's very well in the passing game. And honestly, I think we could have probably saw him closer to $8,000. So I actually think we're getting a pretty decent price point on him. So at this point, we have $5,100 left. I think it would make some sense to get some Raiders run back options here with our Cowboy stacks. I would like to get in Darren Waller. It'd be nice if we could fit him in. I know there's been some games where he just doesn't really meet expectations for his price point, but the targets are still there. It's just, I was kind of hoping for nearly 10 almost every single game this season, but still 8, 5, 11, 7, 8 the past month or so now. Good spot versus Dallas. They have not been very good for trend so far. So we're going to plug in Darren Waller. It's not going to be that hard to fit him in because we have so much value at the running back with Dave Montgomery and then these dirt cheap options like Cedric Wilson. Michael Gallup's not dirt cheap, but he's still below 6K. and the wide receiver 1 for Dak Prescott. So we still have over $4,500 left for the last couple of spots. Factor in a cheap defense. Like, I feel like the Bears are probably the best way to go here, so we'll plug them in. Decent correlation with Dave Montgomery. I know we already have DeAndre Swift, but just kind of hard to avoid not having any players versus your defense on a 3-game slate. So at this point, we have $5,500 left for the wide receiver and flex spot. I don't think we can afford Stephon Diggs. If we did, we might have to go to like a Jawan Johnson at $2,600, which is fine if you wanted to just absolutely force in Stephon Diggs. Because we don't have any Bills exposure right now, which does feel a little bit terrifying, so I could totally understand wanting to jam in Diggs. I don't think it's a must, but you could certainly do it. You'd have to use like a Noah Brown instead if you didn't want to go Jawan Johnson, which again, I don't hate that. But if you wanted to go more balanced, maybe get like a Hunter Renfrow just to keep on stacking this game up, he's $5,200 or $5,600, and that would leave you with $5,400 left, which is another cowboy like Dalton Schultz, which just kind of keeps on stacking that game up. That might be too much of a stack, but it is totally an option on this slate. And obviously, if you want to go with Josh Allen, you start with Stephon Diggs. You could throw in a Cole Beasley, maybe a Dawson Knox, run it back with a guy on the Saints, like Mark Ingram if he happens to play, or Jawan Johnson, or whatever wide receiver you so happen to choose. So there's a lot of ways you can go on the slate, but I'm super excited for this slate as it should be a fun one. And I think it's going to be pretty much it for the video. So I hope it was helpful, and if it was, make sure you leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet already. If you want to take that one step further, an official member over on Patreon. Link is down below in the description for that. And like I said, since we're at the end of the month, if you do want to sign up, you can get this last week for free, assuming you stay signed up on December 1st. So I'll just refund one of the charges for you, if that makes any sense to you. And don't forget, this video was sponsored by Prize Picks, just you versus projections. And as of right now, if you do sign over there, you can get a free money bonus up to $100 when you use code CPEN and tell them I sent you. But I think that'll be it. I will stop rambling. I wish you guys a fantastic Thanksgiving. I hope it's full of food, football, family, friends, or whatever makes you happy on Thanksgiving. So I'll see you guys in the next one, and hope you guys enjoy your holidays.